Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silver Mont, and this video is designed to be an introduction to tanking in Final Fantasy XIV, a starter guide you might say. Whilst playing the game and generally looking at the community, I've seen people remark on how the prospect of tanking is too intimidating or otherwise off-putting to people who want to try it out. So I thought I'd make a video covering some of the basics, because as someone who's played all three roles and enjoys tanking the most, I think the reputation tanking has as being hard is ill-deserved. Tanking is different to healing and to damage, but there's nothing particularly harder about it overall. So let's say you're just starting 14 and you want to try a tank, but you don't have any preference between the currently available classes. Paladin, which starts as Gladiator, Warrior, which starts as Marauder, Dark Knight, and Gunbreaker. I'll give you a quick breakdown on each of them, but they are largely interchangeable in the sense that everything is viable. Keep in mind, the abilities are like to be tweaked or even removed as the game evolves, so even if Gunbreaker is pushing out the most DPS right now, in the future it might be Dark Knight. But let's start with the quintessential sword and board tank. Paladins use a sword and shield, so they are the classic looking tank. Royal Knights with a magic flair to them, being able to use certain holy themed spells that have Latin names I can't pronounce, like Confiteor. If you are especially daunted by the prospect of tanking, or it's your first time playing and you don't mind a very slow curve, then I would suggest Paladin as a starting tank. It's very simple early on, and I think it is, as of right now, the most intuitive tank. You'll almost always have some form of mitigation on hand, as well as a strong single target heal. As of August 2019, they are able to push out the second most DPS, but keep in mind the gap between the highest DPS tank and the lowest is very small. It's only a few percent really. The tanks are balanced very well right now. They are all good and viable. Warrior has, throughout the game's life, often been considered the strongest tank. Why were they considered the best, the strongest? Because they had a lot of utility, and out of all the tanks they were always able to push out the most damage. The meta in Stormblood, for example, was built around pushing out as much damage as possible. Currently they are third in damage, but they are still extremely strong overall, with a surprisingly low number of abilities. So if you find yourself overwhelmed by multiple action bars all filled up with a dozen icons, Warrior could be your go-to. For a while, Dark Knight was the anti-magic tank. That was their shtick. And whilst Paladin had a healing spell and Warriors had a healing ability, Dark Knights were more about healing through lifesteal. In Shadowbringers, they've been changed significantly, streamlined, simplified, however you want to look at it. They may now be one of the best starting choices. It's worth pointing out though, to unlock Dark Knight, you need to reach Ishgard in the main scenario quest at level 50, and Dark Knight starts at level 30. Whilst they're currently putting out the least amount of damage of all tanks, they do have the best on-demand mitigation, and I'll go more into that a little later in the video. Gunbreaker is the shiny new tank for now, and it's being touted as the most advanced and complicated. Their unique thing is continuation combos, wherein between your damage combo, your spend combo, you can weave in extra skills. So put it one way, you have one combo to build your resource, another combo to spend it, and on your spend combo you can weave in a third combo between each strike. I wouldn't call it overly complex, but Gunbreaker to me does feel like the highest risk-reward tank, with mitigation abilities not quite as safe as the others, but in exchange you do get to push out more damage and look cool whilst doing it. That quick overview out of the way, let's cover the basics of tanking. What is expected of you, how should you proceed, and so forth. And we'll break this bit down into two main aspects, light party content and full party content. Light party is a group of 4, such as dungeons, 1 tank, 1 healer, 2 DPS. Full party would be 8-man groups for raids and trials, 2 tank, 2 healer, 4 DPS in light party. There's also alliance content, which is 3 full parties, each one having one tank. In light party content, you will always be main tanking, whereas in full party, there will be a main tank and an off tank. Whilst self-explanatory, that simply means the main tank will be keeping all of the enemies focused on them, whilst the off tank is there to deal damage and take care of certain mechanics, also to swap with the main tank in certain instances. If there are two powerful enemies, maybe they need to be split up, so the main tank will take one, the off tank will take the other, and split them up in the battle arena. If you're main tanking, enmity is the main thing you want to pay attention to. Enmity, or aggro, determines which party members enemies will be attacking. As a tank, you want to have them be hitting you most of the time. Whilst in the past we had tank and damage stance, these days we only have a new and improved tank stance. This stance will massively increase your enmity generation, and if you are main tanking, you almost always want to have that stance toggled on. So there's no damage penalty, there's no downside to it. So you've come to an enemy that you'll be tanking. It's a very simple approach for the most part. Attack the boss with a ranged attack and start building enmity whilst you position the enemy. Most importantly, turn them away from your group. Many enemies and bosses have cleave attacks that will hit everything in front of them, and in most cases you want to be the only one eating that cleave. Now I personally like to tank bosses at a rear wall of an arena, for example, as opposed to the middle, as it gives more room to move about. But that's also context sensitive, as some bosses may need to be tanked in certain areas, but for the most part you can't go wrong tanking a boss at the rear wall of an arena. There are several bosses in the game who have to be in the centre to cast their strong abilities, so let's say you're tanking them at the edge, then they start marching back to the middle of their own volition. It gives your group a few more moments to prepare for the imminent attack. Also, once you have the boss in position, don't be moving around any more than you have to. Keep the boss in one place. This will make it easier for your monk to do their positional attacks where they need to be hitting the side of the boss or the back of the boss. Keeping enmity is your main priority, and you can check that on the enemy list. You want all of those little dots to be red. You can also see your party's enmity generation by their names, with those little bars. Yours should always be the one that's maxed out. But let's say a party member draws enmity away from you. What's the best thing to do? Well, for starters, the person who draws enmity should bring the enemy to you if needs be. The worst thing you can do as a DPS who's pulled enmity is to start sprinting around like a headless chicken in a futile attempt to avoid being pummeled. Just bring the enemy back to the tank. From the tank's perspective, your first move should be to use your role action Provoke on that enemy. This places you at the top of its enmity list whilst also generating additional enmity. It's an instant ranged ability off your global cooldown, which means you can use it in the middle of a combo if you need to. But considering it does have its own cooldown, I think it's better not to use it for pulling enemies initially, but saving it for when you may need it. If Provoke isn't available, you'll likely have a ranged ability that, whilst it might break up your rotation, is a good option to use to get enmity back. Shield Lob for Paladin, Tomahawk for Warrior, and so on. These generally have bonus enmity generation as well. If that's not enough, go and physically move to it. But these ranged attacks are typically what you will begin an encounter with as well. Pull the enemy with your Tomahawk, your Shield Lob. Let's say you're going through a dungeon and there's a pack of enemies. What's the approach there? Well, as always, you'll want to face them away from your party. If there are 3 or more enemies, that's when you want to use your area of effect rotation to ensure you keep enmity on all of them. Plus, in general, if there's 3 or more enemies, your AoE abilities will do more damage than your single target abilities. That's a general rule of thumb for most situations. 3 or more enemies, grouped up, use AoE. 1 or 2 enemies, single target. Now of course, as a tank, you'll want to have these enemies all grouped together and all attacking you. Every tank has an AoE rotation, so have that ready to go. And let's say this group of enemies you're fighting is 3 sword enemies and 1 caster enemy. Be attacking the caster enemy, because that's the ranged one. The sword enemies will follow you, so then you can be hitting all of the enemies. In a nutshell, the best enemy to hit in a situation like that is the ranged one. Now, before we get onto mitigation, let's talk about interrupts briefly. All tanks have two role abilities that are off the global cooldown, Low Blow and Interject. Low Blow is used to stun enemies, whereas Interject will prevent the casting of spells. For the latter, spells you can interrupt will have an orange pulse around their cast bar, so if you see one of those going on, try and use Interject on it. As for stuns, they can be used in similar situations, but there are some enemies that might be immune to stuns. But also keep in mind, if an enemy is stunned, that is a few seconds where it won't be hitting you, which means less incoming damage. It's very obvious, but you'd be surprised how many tanks are fighting a group of enemies, and they don't stun one of them. It's always worth doing. Now, you're also likely aware that most tanks have mitigation abilities, such as Rampart, which all tanks currently have. Rampart reduces damage taken by 20% for 20 seconds on a 90-second cooldown. It might be tempting to never use this ability until you're in a panic, but I would argue that's not making the most out of it. If you consider the uptime and downtime ratio, I would say it's much better to use this ability and others like it when you know damage is coming, even if you're at 100% health. For example, did you just pull a group of 8 enemies? They're all scratching at you furiously. Well, then you know a lot of damage is going to be incoming, right? Pop Rampart to ease your way. The other important use for these mitigation abilities would be on tank busters. These are ultra powerful attacks that will usually one-shot healers and DPS. As a tank, you can take them, but they're still gonna hurt a lot. Almost all bosses in the game have them. If the boss is looking at you, casting an action, it could well be a tank buster. One classic example would be Titan's Mountain Buster. But until you've been on the receiving end of one, you might not know what it is, so maybe you need to ask your group, hey, what is this boss's tank buster called? Or just be on the lookout, and after you've eaten it once, you know to use your mitigation. So this is the time you want to reduce the incoming damage as much as you can. Time to push out your Rampart or your equivalent ability. These tank busters usually happen in such a rotation that you should be able to mitigate each in some form. Tanks also have a role ability known as Reprisal, which lowers the target's damage by 10%. Using this on tank busters is nice. Reprisal is on a 60-second cooldown. If you're an 8-man content, it means you're going to have 2 tanks, so you can use it in tandem with your off tank. An example, Titan uses Mountain Buster, main tank uses Reprisal on it. Some time passes, he uses it again, off tank uses Reprisal. Now keep in mind, none of this is strictly crucial. You don't have to do this, you don't have to be doing this in tandem with your off tank, but it's good to be aware of. If you're the off tank, watch the boss's buffs and debuffs. If you see there's no reprisal up on a strong attack, now it's time to use yours to help out the main tank. Here's a specific Paladin off tank tip. Let's say you're off tanking and you see the boss is about to use a tank buster on your main tank. As Paladin, you have an ability called Intervention, which reduces target party members' damage taken by 10%. That by itself is nice, especially considering its 10-second cooldown, but it can be further increased to an insane 50% mitigation if you yourself are under the effect of Rampart or Sentinel when you cast Intervention. So it can be a good panic move if you notice your main tank is pretty low health when a tank buster is coming in. You could also use it to mitigate raid-wide AoE damage. For example, Titan is using his ultimate ability, Earthen Fury, which hurts everyone in the raid. Let's say you and a healer are on low health. You can pop Rampart and then use Intervention on the healer to greatly mitigate the damage. Pretty nice, huh? Now if you're off tanking, there'll be times where you need to swap with the main tank. This is typically referred to as a tank swap, unsurprisingly. This can happen for a variety of reasons. First of all, the main tank might die. There's also tank swap mechanics in place where, say, the boss will put a debuff on the tank that causes them to take more damage, and if it's a stacking debuff, it will eventually reach the point where the main tank cannot feasibly continue, so you need to swap with them. What is a good way to go about this? Well, it's a 2-person effort, ideally. You are main tanking and you want to swap with the off tank. Use your shirk ability on them. This will divert 25% of your enmity to them. Next up, turn off your tank stance. If you're the off tank who needs to tag in, turn on your tank stance and then hit provoke. But generally, using provoke should be enough, even if the main tank didn't shirk you. Now, to close the video, let's talk about each tank's variation of certain abilities: personal mitigation, off-tank mitigation, panic button, and raid mitigation. Starting with personal mitigation. As you know, all tanks have Rampart as a role action. Every tank also has a strong personal mitigation on a long cooldown. Paladins have Sentinel, which reduces damage taken by 30% for 10 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. Every other tank has this same ability, just with a different name. Shadow Veil for Dark Knight, Nebula for Gunbreaker. Warrior is the interesting one here. Vengeance works the same as all the others in that it reduces damage taken 30% for 10 seconds, but in addition, it counterattacks automatically each time you take a physical hit for the duration, which means that if you're doing a large pool, many enemies, you'll be having a wonderful time once you pop Vengeance. In that aspect then, Warrior is a clear winner. In addition to the long cooldowns, we have the short cooldown mitigations of each tank. Paladin has my personal favourite for sheer style points, Sheltron. This blocks all incoming attacks for 6 seconds. Blocking an attack is somewhere in the vicinity of 15 to 20% reduction, but of course this scales with gear to some extent too. Unfortunately, while Sheltron is very cool, it costs meter to use, which means you generally won't be able to use it at the start of an encounter. Warriors, meanwhile, have Raw Intuition, which has a 25-second cooldown and reduces damage taken by 20% for 5 seconds. So whilst it has a longer cooldown than Sheltron, and you can't use it back to back, if you have enough meter on your Paladin that is, it is more reliable and generally you'll be able to use it anytime there's a big incoming attack. Then we have Dark Knight's Blackest Night ability, which in my opinion is the strongest short cooldown mitigation of them all. Unfortunately, you need to wait until level 70 to get it, but it's worth. Blackest Night creates a barrier around the target that absorbs 25% of their total health as damage. It lasts 7 seconds and has a 15-second cooldown. It also grants the Dark Knight Dark Arts when the barrier absorbs the full amount. The downside is it costs 3000 of your 10,000 mana. It can be cast on the Dark Knight or a party member. And as it isn't strictly speaking mitigation, but absorption, it's just downright better. Finally, we have Gunbreaker's Heart of Stone. 25-second cooldown, 15% damage reduction for 7 seconds on either self or party member. If you use it whilst Brutal Shell is up, it'll also give the target Brutal Shell's effects. It is simple, and I would argue it's the weakest of the bunch, but it's still worth using. Just like with Paladin's Intervention, if you're off-tanking, you can stick it on the main tank when you see a tank buster. Speaking of which, off-tank mitigation, by which I mean mitigation you can cast on another party member, doesn't have to be the main tank. Paladins have the aforementioned Intervention, Warriors have Nascent Flash, Dark Knights and Gunbreakers use their self-mitigation, Blackest Night and Heart of Stone, respectively. I think Paladins have the best one here, purely because you can combine Intervention with Sentinel or Rampart to give them insane mitigation. But if we're talking less pure mitigation and more utility, then Warriors have the most useful one here, with Nascent Flash. Which brings us to Panic Button, or you could call it Invincible Button or Ultimate Ability, whatever floats your boat. We'll start with the poster boy, Hallowed Ground for Paladin. If you ever played World of Warcraft, you probably remember the infamous Paladin bubble. Well, 14 Paladins have something very similar. Hallowed Ground makes you impervious to almost all attacks for 10 seconds on a 420-second cooldown, which might be the biggest cooldown in the entire game. There are countless applications. You can use it on a giant pool of enemies. You can use it when you're about to die. You can use it to skip certain strong mechanics. You name it. Then we have Warrior's Holmgang on a far shorter 240-second cooldown. It lasts 6 seconds and prevents most attacks from reducing your health to less than 1. Oh, and it chains your target to you as well. This is one of the best, if not the best. It's a toss-up between Hallowed Ground and Holmgang in my opinion. The latter can be used more frequently, but it doesn't make you invincible, it just stops you from dying, which for all intents and purposes is just as useful. Then we have Dark Knight's Living Dead, which is probably the worst of the bunch. 300-second cooldown, lasts 10 seconds. If you are killed whilst Living Dead is active, you will instead turn into a sort of zombie for 10 seconds. Whilst a zombie, you can't be killed by most attacks. However, if you are not healed to full health during those 10 seconds, once the time is up, you will die. You need to be healed to full health after Walking Dead is triggered. Finally, we have Gunbreaker's Super Belied, which I think that means something like Super Meteor? It's better than Living Dead, just about. Super Belied has a 360-second cooldown, meaning it's the second longest, and it lasts 8 seconds. Whilst active, you will be invincible like Hallowed Ground, but activating it will reduce you to 1 hit point. So the smart thing to do would be use it when you're low health, or use it when you know your white mage has Benediction. Being reduced to 1 hit point, it then gives your healers 8 seconds to heal you whilst you're invincible. But this category is quite clear cut to me. Paladins and warriors have the best options. Finally, we have raid-wide mitigation. Paladins have 2 options here, Divine Veil and Passage of Arms. The former is a raid-wide shield with a rather confusing tooltip. When you are healed whilst Divine Veil is active, it will cast a 10% health shield on the group. This shield will be dispelled when the target is healed again. You can use it when a raid-wide attack is incoming. Passage of Arms, meanwhile, creates a cone of protection behind you, and people who are standing in that cone will take 15% less damage. It will also increase your block rate to 100%, and it lasts for 18 seconds. Next up, we have Warrior's Shake It Off ability, which creates a shield around nearby party members equal to 12% of their health, and that amount is larger if you had other buffs active, as it will consume those buffs to increase the strength of the shield. Dark Knight's get Dark Missionary, which reduces incoming magic damage for you and nearby party members by 10% for 15 seconds. Very basic, and you'll notice it's not all damage, only magic. Fortunately, most raid-wide super attacks tend to be magic in most scenarios. Finally, Gunbreakers have Heart of Light, which is identical to Dark Missionary. Shake It Off is extremely good, but I think Paladin is the best here because you have 2 raid-wide abilities. If we're talking the best single ability, it's probably Shake It Off, but Paladin wins overall for having 2. But as you can see, most abilities are like for like, more or less. Gunbreaker has the most damage, Warrior has the best all-round utility, but even if Dark Knight is the weakest tank right now in terms of damage, you can still clear all the content with them. That said, perhaps Square should look into giving Dark Knights something to make them more attractive. In my opinion, Dark Knight should be doing the second most damage behind Gunbreakers, whereas Paladins, as much as I love Paladin, I think they should be doing the least amount of damage. But that covers all the important stuff. If you're going through a dungeon for the first time, especially as a tank, it's a good idea to announce that in the chat. Let them know to expect maybe not giant pools. If it's a trial or other 8-man content, you might want to off-tank it first, so you get a feel for the fight, so you can see what the tank busters are. You'll typically be the one pulling as a main tank, so in dungeons, make sure to gather up the enemies. You also might want to pace yourself, see how much you can manage. Is your healer suitably geared? Are you suitably geared and confident? Then feel free to pick up a bunch of enemies at once. But don't be afraid to go one group at a time. If you're in leveling gear or your eye level isn't high, that's probably the best bet. All in all, even at its most complex, tanking has never been some great task that only superheroes can do. Shadowbringers has streamlined it and made it more accessible than ever. As for how the meta changes in the coming months and years, well, we'll have to wait and see. But as for now, I hope this guide was useful. and if you have any questions or tips that I don't know or forgot to mention, leave them down below in the comments. Until next time, you take care. Ciao.